Welcome to Books and Bridges, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. We are a humanities institute of ideas and conversation. Whether through literature, philosophy, or history, we promote searching, sincere dialogue across the human spectrum and value the beauty and depth it brings to our public interactions. The wisdoms of the world lift us to the higher and better angels of our nature. Tonight, we explore the beauty and paradox of the French personality. Through the images, scenes, and characters of Victor Hugo's beloved works, we hope to uncover glimpses of the soul that sustains the people of France. Great literary expressions often convey the depth and meaning of human life through the language and symbols of faith, even if those traditions have long faded. Ever since the French philosophes ushered in the age of reason, the place of organized religion has moved away from the center of public life. But the specter of faith still haunts behind the stage. How do the vestiges of religion, spirituality, and ritual seep into the mental landscape of modern secular society and so stubbornly stick in our moral imagination? We are fortunate to have Anca Sprenger with us to help answer this question. Dr. Sprenger received a BA in French literature at the University of Bucharest, a DEA in French literature at the University of Paris, and a PhD in French literature at the University of South Carolina. Her interests focus on the persistence of sacred discourse in modern literary texts. She analyzes the way in which sacred gestures and spiritual discourses are recuperated and encoded in modern French literature. She also enjoys Romanian and French film, food, the literature of the fantastic, and Romanian contemporary society. Dr. Sprenger has been teaching at Brigham Young University for nearly 20 years. So thank you so much for coming tonight, Dr. Sprenger. I will turn the time over to you. And afterwards, we can have a question and answer session. So feel free at that point to submit a question through the Q&A button. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. And thank you for your presentation. I have to say that I really liked some terms that you used, because you talked about the specters of certain, or the specter of some, long gone beliefs. And you also used the word haunting. Yeah, I think that, so maybe there was something like ruin or residue. So I think that, these all have to do with what I will talk about now, because all these are very unique phenomena that we see in France in I would say, quite unusual ways. So I would like to start with something that has to do with contemporary France, because in about 2 weeks, almost everything will be closed in France because it's a holiday. It is the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. That is, to the Catholics, Virgin Mary's earthly life ended and her body and soul were taken to heaven. I will not get into theological details, but I would like to mention some other important holidays in France. Many of them are linked to public school vacations, and on these occasions, almost everything from banks to government offices may be closed. So they have La Toussaint, All Saints, Christmas, of course, Lundi de Pâques, Easter Monday, Ascension, the ascent of Jesus Christ into heaven, Pentecôte, the Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Spirit onto the disciples of Jesus, the 50th day after Easter. And these coexist with July 14th, the national holiday, the armistice, and others. Now, all these religious holidays may not surprise us if we think of the Catholic roots of the French society. We can see such holidays in other countries that have deep Catholic roots. For instance, in Italy, we should not be surprised if we see the city police playing music at a religious procession. But France is different. So this should actually surprise us, because The efforts to cut these religious roots in France have existed for centuries. Nathan, you mentioned the philosophers of the Enlightenment. And to this, we could obviously add the French Revolution. The French Revolution strived to destroy the Ancien Régime, or the old regime, at the same time in a meticulous and violent way. As the French Romantic author Alfred de Musset put it, many kings had been killed in French history, many things had been destroyed, but never had the actual institutions of monarchy and Catholic Church been stripped of their meaning, killed not just materially, physically, if we can say that, but symbolically into their deep transcendent meaning. According to the same Alfred de Musset, after this, it was Napoleon who actually sealed the tombstone of the dead and buried Catholic Church. And the attempts to revive that reminded him of mummified corpses and ghosts. This already sounds quite dark, quite Gothic even, with corpses and ghosts and undead. But we should think that with the revolution, an entire world that was built on centuries of monarchy and Catholicism was itself, the spine or the soul, if you want, of monarchy. So all this had collapsed. The revolution tried to dismantle religion. The Catholic cult was banned. The priests were persecuted from forcing them to get married. So, they wanted Catholic priests to get married, to literally execute them. I just had some images of priests being beheaded, just, the aristocrats were during the revolution, and churches that were burned, just to give you some examples of deliberate attempts to erase centuries of Catholicism. There were the steeples of Catholic churches were shortened in some regions because they didn't want these steeples or churches to be taller than civil buildings. Churches were vandalized. They were turned into ammunition storage. They were burnt, demolished. Even nowadays, there are archaeological digs that can find evidence of this revolutionary vandalism. And so religious symbols and images were all replaced with secular Republican images. And we're talking obviously about the French Republican. And even the calendar is revolutionized, and a new calendar is created. And the new calendar is, starts on September 22nd, called Premier Vendémiaire, because this was considered the beginning of a new era. And, it had new names for the months, it had new holidays. So we are watching this total deep transformation of the French society. And this transformation is, meant to erase all religious meanings, all religious memory. And of course, many institutions are affected by these changes. One of them is marriage. So the Catholics used to have sacred marriage, and that was, so it took place in a church, and there was a priest who would marry, who would unite these the spouses. And with the revolution, there's an epidemic of divorces because marriage is no longer a sacred union. And then the priests who were finally allowed to perform such ceremonies had to be certified by the state. So, I just mentioned marriage, and marriage is no longer this sacred union, but turns into this civil union. So, with all these changes, so I'm not going to dwell a lot on these measures of erasing anything religious in French culture, society, and politics, because there are way too many. But, so when the French monarchy restored in 1814, the monarchy and the power of the Catholic Church, we could say that it was too late, because after all these measures of erasing faith, erasing Catholicism, erasing this religious past, could church really be revived or resuscitated or basically brought back from the dead as if nothing had happened? So the restoration of the monarchy was in any way interrupted by a brief return of Napoleon. Then there was the July monarchy, then a new revolution with a new republic, then a second empire. So this is why the Romantic generation is basically confused or lost, as Alfred de Musset describes this generation, because they were marked by these events that had shaken their world, and they had shaken the values. And they were trapped between a past that was at the same time dead and undead, with all the back and forth, and a future that wasn't there yet and was quite confusing. So this is why, in this context, we have many 19th century French authors obsessed with ruins, with cursed aristocratic, families, and with all kinds of secrets. So we have, undead past, ghosts, haunted dark medieval castles, cathedral with cracked bells in their bell towers. So this is very symbolic, because the cathedral is still there, but is not alive. And the bells are there, but they cannot produce a sound because they're cracked. So it's this idea of like the ruin or the ghost. It's there and not there, is sort of present, but at the same time dead. So we could say that in many of these fantastic novels or stories, the past is a constant hidden presence, a reminder of the dead old regime, and at the same time, a reminder of the fact that these fundamental values, institutions, these beliefs of the old regime could not be completely evacuated. So they were displaced, they were often distorted, but they kept manifesting themselves in something unusual, unexpected, sometimes toxic, and sometimes in deadly ways, just because it couldn't be just simply erased. So most of the French romantics, with very few exceptions, were not religious, but religion does appear in their works because they're, let's say, haunted by this religious past. They're searching a form of transcendence. There's a quest for something meaningful in this emptiness, in this deliberate destruction that the revolution had done. So, you may have characters who are looking for transcendence or for religion, not in a church, for instance, but in nature. So this is, something very common in Romantic literature, because nature had not been touched or altered by society or by history, as churches had. So when it appears in a distorted way, like the dark priest, for instance, or very often in Romantic French literature, the catastrophically failed marriage. So Scott Springer, has been working, my husband, he has been working on these representations of catastrophic marriages in 19th century literature. One would expect that romantic literature would have some, like, as we say, romantic love, and they would live happily ever after. That never happens, at least in French literature. There is no, happy marriage. Most of the times it ends in like a violent death, something like, very dramatic. So this is a reminder that the ancien régime, the old regime, cannot be brought back intact from the dead. So I would like to talk a little bit about the sacred as a concept. As in many of these 19th or even 20th century works, so we can say that there's much about, they're talking much about religion, as Catholicism was sort of dead or undead, but it's about the sacred. So in his book, The Man and the Sacred, the philosopher Roger Caillois defined the sacred as what is not profane. I know that this doesn't seem as a very serious definition. It does not even seem to have the acceptable structure of a definition. But we can see that it is actually a very good definition, because we define what is sacred, opposing it to what is not sacred. So the sacred and the profane define each other. So I would like to take the example of fasting, for instance, because fasting can substantially be the same if done as a sacred ritual, that is, people abstain from food when fasting, and as something required for medical testing or medical procedures like an MRI or surgery, or even as a weight loss method, because there are people who are practicing the intermittent fasting or something like this. So sometimes even the word is the same and the action is the same, or lack of, because you are not eating, but they're completely different. And so are, for instance, the days. So they all have 24 hours and so on, but the day designated for certain rituals, whether they take or not place, is different. So as Roger Caillois puts it, the profane or non-sacred time is amorphous, homogeneous, while the sacred time has certain very precise divisions. And we can think of, those holidays I mentioned they have in France, and it's interesting that they still have those religious holidays in place. Mircea Eliade, a historian of religions, wrote in his book, The Sacred and the Profane, that even the most secular society cannot completely evacuate the sacred. The sacred will find new ways of expression, places, gestures, and times. And this is the case of the French society. And if, say, like Emmanuel Macron's France is still inexplicably, and I would say even frivolously, celebrating the Assumption, we can imagine that for Victor Hugo, for whom this displacement of the sacred was so recent, he was born in 1802. So the sacred was, or the reminiscence of sacred, was so much more present in everything that was still haunted by these memories in the French society. So like many of his contemporaries, Hugo is aware that there is no undoing of the revolution. There is no return of the ancien régime. But the sacred still appears as a deep need, as a guide, as a set of values that need to be defined and redefined. We have to say that Hugo gives poets, and actually himself, a huge importance in expressing the sacred. So it is actually Hugo who said, "Le poète, c'est le verbe, et le verbe, c'est Dieu." The poet is the word in the biblical sense, and the word is God. Talking about definitions, we can say that Victor Hugo is basically defining himself or presenting himself, as God, basically, when saying that the poet is the word and the word is God. So because he's the poet. But yes, so for him and for many other 19th century writers, it's the writer, the poet, who is the new, the new expression of the sacred. So, of course, throughout a very long career, Hugo, who changed a lot, his political affiliations and who was raised Catholic but became very critical of Catholicism, he wrote very different works. But we should not forget that he actually did write religious poems. So in some, he basically rewrote passages of the Bible. So, there's a famous poem called La Conscience, conscious, yes. And although he seems to talk about something that is not necessarily expressed in the Bible, that is conscious, having a conscious. He talks about Cain and Abel episode, and this is his way of rewriting a sacred text, rewriting the Bible, and he does that in other poems too. We should not, forget, of course, the Hunchback of Notre Dame. So he wrote that in 1831. Les Miserables, separated, so these two novels are separated by, several decades, 30 years. But they all deal in very unique ways with the sacred. So Victor Hugo wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, especially because he wanted to draw the attention of the public to the cathedral that was neglected, believe it or not. And we can say that his strategy worked, because Notre Dame, that was neglected in Hugo's time, is now seen as a symbol of Paris, as a symbol of France, as a symbol of French history, and many other cultural, historical, spiritual values. So, but back then the cathedral was neglected. The cathedral itself had the fate common to many cathedrals during the Revolution, that it was vandalized, with statues that were beheaded. It served also as an ammunition storage, as a temple de la raison, temple of reason. Many decades later, it was restored in a tasteless and rather utilitarian way. And during Hugo's time, the cathedral was basically falling apart. Before the Romantics, the Gothic was not like as an architectural style. It was not seen as an interesting or beautiful style. And it is Romantics like Hugo who helped rediscover the appreciation for the Gothic. But anyway, the cathedral is like the main character of the novel. And it inspires actually many pages about love, justice, charity, good, evil, redemption. So there are all these values that are conveyed through this cathedral. There are, of course, some paradoxes, and we see that in many Gothic texts, because the priest himself, so the religious man in the text, is seen as a dark, sinful character. He's cruel and he's tortured by all kinds of illicit desires and obsessions. While the monster, Quasimodo, is the good character, and he's capable of basically Christian, unconditional love, self-sacrifice. And surprisingly, even Esmeralda, the gypsy dancer with her white goat, is attributed sacred characteristics. Hugo actually, literally compares her to the Virgin Mary. I had a student who wrote a thesis on Esmeralda as a paradoxically, sacred creature. And Victor Hugo said that God would have maybe preferred Esmeralda to the Virgin Mary, or equivalated, the Virgin Mary to Esmeralda. So this may sound quite, sacrilegious. So while Esmeralda is just a gypsy dancer suspected of sorcery, she's also capable of self-sacrifice, unconditional love. She is a martyr, and she dies innocent. Now, if we talk about the sacred in the Hunchback of Notre Dame, we may wonder why precisely Frollo, the priest, is the evil character. But this is typical of many Gothic characters, where the ancient values are reversed and distorted because, as I said before, there is no possible return to the past, because even if brought back, the past could not be the same. So I talked earlier about the Restoration. So when France tried to restore the monarchy and Catholicism, that didn't work, because that could not be done after what happened during the revolution. So, the same thing, that is, this distortion happens with various rituals when represented in 19th century literature. I mentioned, for instance, marriage, that used to be a sacred union, and now it can only be a failed union. I would like to talk a little bit now about Les Misérables. So Les Misérables was written 30 years after Notre Dame de Paris. Many things had happened in between, in the world, in France, and in Hugo's life. But Les Misérables is filled with sacred references, while, of course, they're, just like in the Hunchback of Notre Dame, paradoxical. So I'll just give some examples. First of all, Jean Valjean is condemned for stealing, but he didn't steal something prosaic. Like, he didn't steal cheese or sausage. He stole bread, and he sacrificed himself to feed that bread to children and a poor woman. So this is very, this is a very Christian gesture. This is very symbolic, and sharing bread as a form of sacrifice, is obviously a biblical reference. Now, human justice condemns him for doing a deeply charitable deed. And of course, Jean Valjean is not exactly a model of honesty, because he was morally damaged by being in jail. So the society, turned him into, a sinner, basically. So when he is given shelter by Monseigneur Myriel, he steals his silverware. But his soul is saved by Monseigneur Myriel. And yet we have again another problem, because Monseigneur Myriel, who's said to live like a saint, has to lie in order to save Jean Valjean. And Hugo deals at length on several pages with this problem when he talks about Monseigneur Myriel lying, and then, in general, when he talks about religious people lying. Because Jean Valjean will be later saved again by some nuns who also have to lie for him. And that, as Hugo underscores, like on those pages about, living a good Christian life and lying, that is not acceptable according to what Hugo says. So we have these ambiguous and paradoxical gestures, and signs and characters, plus some of these religious hints that Hugo sprinkles in his text. Because we should not forget that Jean Valjean falls into the water from a ship. He's thought dead, and then he resurrects. So of course, being thought dead, but then resurrecting, that's an obvious biblical allusion. And Valjean comes back in a way like through a baptism, because he was immersed in water, and he comes back with a new name and identity, because he becomes Monsieur Madeleine, with an allusion to forgiven sins, and Magdalene, right? Um, Now, with death and resurrection, Valjean is not the only Christ-like character in Les Miserables. We can think of Fantine's suffering and humiliation, and of the fact that she too sacrifices herself in order to save her child. And on her deathbed, Fantine is portrayed in a position that reminds us of Christ on the cross, while Madeleine, and here we're talking about Monsieur Madeleine, weeps near her. So we don't want to fiddle anymore with sharing the screen, but you can find many Catholic images of Mary Magdalene weeping by Christ on the cross. So it's an image that is very common in Catholic iconography. Of course, as Christ-like figure as she may be, Fantine was a prostitute, and we could think of other surprising Christ-like figures. And let's take Eponine, because she was a mean and cynical and selfish and cruel girl. At the end of her life, she saves Marius, taking the bullet that was destined to him. And as she does this, she sacrifices herself, and her hand is pierced by the bullet. And this is, of course, another image reminiscent, of course, of Christ on the cross. And, it's interesting because Marius thinks she's dead and kisses her on the forehead, and then she comes back. So, I have a little quote from Les Miserables. She let her head fall back up upon Marius's knees, and her eyelids closed. He thought that poor soul had gone. Eponine lay motionless, but just when Marius supposed her forever asleep, she slowly opened her eyes, in which the gloomy deepness of death appeared, and said to him with an accent of sweetness, which already seemed to come from another world, "And then, Monsieur Marius, I believe I was a little in love with you." So we have another Christ-like image or character. We could think also about Cosette going to get water in the forest. So again, the choice is symbolic. Is the Thénardier don't send her to get something else like hay for the horses. So it's water that she's supposed to go. And we know that water is an element considered sacred in most cultures. And Cosette's walk with a heavy bucket through the woods is described by Hugo much like, a chemin de croix, Christ carrying the cross. And as she stops, she stops every now and then, with her bucket of water. She replicates the station de croix, the stops on this way. And there's another, really intriguing sentence in this description, because once she arrives at the fountain, Hugo says God was the only one to see that. And right after the sentence, there's a huge hand that lifts Cosette's bucket and helps her. So whose hand was this? Hugo just said that God was the only one to see that. It was Jean Valjean's hand. And Cosette somehow miraculously is not afraid. So it was Jean Valjean or Monsieur Madeleine. So we have, obviously, Monsieur Madeleine or Jean Valjean designated or depicted as God. So I'm not going to make a list of all the biblical references or all of the Christ-like characters or of each resurrection or redemption in Les Miserables for several reasons. One of them is that there are too many. They're incredibly numerous. And the other one is that they may seem questionable. So, one may wonder, how is it that a prostitute and a thief and an ugly little girl and a cynical young woman can be portrayed as Christ-like figures? And how can Marius and Cosette, so they finally marry, their relationship and union is presented as a purely spiritual love. Hugo writes, a kiss, that was all, to describe this relationship in an image that again replicates Christian iconography. So I'm thinking, so I'm sorry I cannot show you these images, but they're paintings and frescoes representing the marriage of the Virgin, and also other Catholic representations of sacred unions, which are purely sacred. So there are purely sacred kisses. There are representations, religious representations of St. Peter and Paul kissing, and they're kissing on the mouth, which can be surprising for us, but it is perceived as a purely spiritual kiss, a purely sacred kiss that just, symbolizes a form of pure union. There are also representations of the union of Church and Christ, and they're also represented with a kiss. So Hugo actually is not at all ironic when he attributes all these Christian qualities to such unlikely characters. We know that he was very critical of the Catholic Church, but he's not at all critical of, say, like a fictional priest who, in Les Miserables, unlike Frollo, sins, but in order to have a soul. It is a questionable concept that Hugo, as I said, discusses at length. Hugo, while not religious, is aware of the need of some sacred dimensions in people's lives. And it is true that he invests these sacred dimensions in unexpected characters, in ordinary characters, in ordinary people. So this may be, the way Hugo is, say, like revolutionary. He does not expect the traditional church to provide these dimensions anymore. And anyway, as I said, he was very critical of the Catholic Church. But he uses all these references that were very familiar, all these images and symbols to communicate that. So we could say that on the ruins of the Ancien Régime, he's aware of something, we could call it transcendent, that persists. Such religious themes and symbols appear in many French authors who are not religious. Of course, we could mention Marcel Proust with his remembrance of things past. This huge novel was also translated as In Search of Lost Time. I prefer the remembrance of things past. So in Proust's novel, there's the famous passage of the Madeleine Cookie. Obviously, that's another religious reference, which is dipped in tea in a communion-like gesture, and it produces an incredibly deep and rich experience that doesn't have to do with the actual material cookie itself. So we could say that French society had been built on a structure that was destroyed, especially with the French Revolution, then rebuilt. And when it was rebuilt, it could only use pieces of what was before. And the language that communicates about something transcendent, about something sacred, remained the same and used the same familiar images. Coming back to nowadays, it is very interesting that in a country obsessed with being secular, with the separation of church and state, you still have public school cafeterias that still don't serve meat on Fridays because Catholics don't eat meat on Friday. And many newspapers tell you what saint is celebrated that specific day. By the way, today is Saint Nazaire and Saint Samson. So the laïcité, which is a very French concept, that refers to the separation between church and state, has been written into the Constitution. And it is a French obsession. And, I just brought, I don't know if you can see these. These are just a couple of books on secularization and laïcité, the school, the church, and the republic, history of the laïcité française, histoire de la laïcité, the birth of an ideal, laïcité and modernity, birth of the laïcité, the religion and the city, the separation of church and state, the new anti-Christianism, and so on. So this is an obsession. And as I said, there are many, we have the laïcité written into the Constitution. There's more and more people who say liberté, égalité, fraternité, laïcité, because laïcité can be added to those three revolutionary and republican principles. And nowadays there are many laws that try to ban what has been called ostentatious religious symbols in public places. And yet the sacred dimensions, I would say a little like the Terminator, keep saying, I'll be back, and keep appearing in new and unexpected forms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sprenger, and thank you everyone for bearing with the technical difficulties. We got the interface back and working, and there may be a chance yet to show some of your images if we can figure out the share screen difficulty. But I hope everyone can feel free to submit questions through the Q&A button. I have a question just to start out.
Please.
And that is, this is such a fascinating analysis that you put forward. What I see at work here are a number of dualities kind of warring against each other, whether it's the sacred versus the profane, the religious versus the secular, maybe you could even say morality versus human rights, the enlightenment or reason versus maybe intuition or something like that. What do you think is lost with the fading of religion, and what might be gained with the rise of the Enlightenment?
Well, I think that in a way, if we look at the Romantics, so I'm looking at Hugo and other Romantic writers, the loss is huge. And I would say that the French Romantics are more lost than other Romantics, because in other countries there hadn't been this deep destruction of everything, like all the values, all the fundamental values. So Alfred de Musset, that I mentioned before, has this novel called The Confession of a Child of the Century. So he's talking about the 19th century. And in the preface, he just talks about how the Romantics are lost. I think that, well, yes, maybe there's this, there are other ways of exploring the world. But, if we look at even the personal experiences or, the losses in some of these Romantics families, many of them had parents, grandparents who were beheaded. Some of them wanted to be married, but wanted the ceremony to be performed by a priest who was not, who had not signed that agreement with the state because it wasn't sacred enough for them. and that's why, we have this really interesting rediscovery of nature. So maybe this is a gain. So a new look on nature, finding, maybe looking for the sacred everywhere. This is a result of this loss. So, there, even Hugo, has some really interesting and beautiful pages about the sea, about earth. So yeah, maybe, this could be seen as a gain that stems from this loss. But yeah, they were really lost, I would say.
Yeah, I think there's so many gains that we can see with the onset of the Enlightenment, a world governed by human rights, reason. The operation of reason can, offset some of the harms and damages of superstition. But it is so true, I think, and your presentation really makes that clear, that the human being seems to have a kind of a nature that is fixed to kind of towards reverence, towards seeking something sacred.
Yeah.
And it may come to us in repackaged forms, like you say, in a distorted form or an inverted form, but it doesn't seem like it can be obliterated.
Exactly. Yes. So, the empty space that was created by, say, like the Enlightenment or the Revolution had to be filled with, some sacred values. So it is true that, for instance, with the human rights, in a way, the human being is perceived as sacred, where they're talking about like sacred rights of the human being. And the revolution is at the origin of human rights. So, we have the Declaration of Human Rights, so the French wrote that. And Hugo was a big defender of human rights. As we mentioned before, he was much ahead of his time. He was against slavery and against the death penalty. And as I said, he was pro-European, way ahead of his time. So yeah,
As you mentioned, the role of the poet as being, almost on par with the voice of God. It leads me to believe that the sacred is something that we both seek, and it's something that we also create as human beings. Tell us what you think about what comprises the sacred, and if there are human and divine elements in there. How do you think that works? It's a mystery, I think.
Well, so is as I said in that definition, the sacred is invested or perceived by us as sacred. So unlike the religious, so the religious is something different, but with the sacred, say churches were desecrated during the revolution. Marriage was desecrated during the revolution, or even like the some religious practices. But so the values that that distinguishes these phenomena, they can still be, how should I say, like invisibly present in all these, in places, times, and so on. So I'm coming back to this definition of, say like sacred time and sacred and secular or profane time or space. The sacred operates certain divisions. So just think of the difference between, say, the sidewalk around a church or a temple and, the temple itself. So maybe it's, so it could be the same material, but it is the value that is invested in that church. And there has to be the knowledge of, or the acceptance, or, the belief that that space is sacred. Because for somebody who doesn't know that, a certain space is sacred, it's something different. And, I'm thinking of paradoxical American situations where you have certain churches that operate in like a 7-Eleven after hours, or maybe not 7-Eleven, because 7-Eleven is open all the time. But there are certain churches that operate in buildings that are not sacred all the time. They're, more than profane, like a small supermarket in a, small community. They don't have another space. Or we can even think of like basketball in a church. So, what do you think about that? See what I mean? So basketball per se is not a sacred activity. And at the same time, the church, because we allowed that to be there, is not desecrated by the existence of, certain activities. Does this make sense?
Yeah, there's definitely an element of our own investment into the sacred, but there's also this sense that it does rely on something transcendent.
Yes,
exactly. We think of any number of human activities or relics or traditions can be sacred, but if they're only invested in the human or the mortal, then we probably wouldn't consider them sacred. But
right,
like you said, there's an invisible element to it that kind of underlies and hovers around.
And that comes through a certain, we could say like a ritual, a certain consecration, or something is communicated and establishes. So we are made aware of the sacred component or the sacred element of that space, for instance, or that time. So if we get confused about Sunday, or I don't know, with the time change, when does Sunday begin, and see what I mean? So it involves a labeling, it involves a knowledge, it involves a community or communitarian acceptance of this transcendent dimension. It cannot be something purely individual.
Right. So we have a question from Ruth Bellinger. There's a lot of French in here, so I'll pronounce as best as I can. She asks, in the vieille chanson, why is the religious year divided des Pâques à la Toussaint, Noël et la Saint-Jean? Is it almost like crossing yourself across the 4 cardinal directions? You see her question?
Yes, I cannot, okay. I cannot see the question, but I think, so I think that it is that, crossing yourself in the 4 cardinal directions. And, it's actually, talking about these sacred divisions of time. And it's the presence of, just if we think of all these, like la Toussaint and la Saint-Jean, they are associated not just with holidays, but with certain, elements of nature, changes in weather even. So I think that this is almost like having the entire world kind of covered by these divisions. So their holidays, their temporal divisions, their rituals, and they all sort of englobe or cover the entire existence.
Yeah, encompassing.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
Do you think that the sacred needs the institutional? Does the sacred need the religious in order to really have an effect? Does the
Well-
religious need the sacred?
Well, we're living in a world that is less and less religious. If we look at France, they, some of them consider themselves Catholic, but this is why they perceive, for instance, Islam as such a danger, because Muslim, the Muslim community is way more active in practicing their religion, while the Catholics are not. So France is less and less religious, and yet there are all kinds of forms of sacred that persist. And this is why sometimes there's this fear of the sacred. So there's this constant effort to evacuate anything that could be sacred in the public space. And as I said, it's like a French obsession, because in spite of the sort of loss of a serious Catholic involvement or practices, the sacred is still quite present. So I think that you're okay.
What do you think are the reasons for the persecution of the Catholic Church in the French Revolution?
Well, the Catholic Church was politically, economically extremely powerful. So the connection between the Catholic Church and monarchy were, extremely strong. So they were basically seen as just, one thing, one source of power. And the Catholic Church was also a very rich and powerful institution itself, even without the monarchy. So yes, it represented from any power, money, even exploitation of the poor and so on. So yeah.
I read a quote from, it was attributed to Victor Hugo, but I think it was actually another Frenchman who said this, but he said that religions fade away, but God will remain, or something like that. And if you replace the sacred, or substitute the sacred for God there, I think that's something true about the sacred always remains. It will always, I think, adapt to the times. And religious institutions will always change as well. There's always flux happening. But I can't imagine human beings being human beings without the creation and making the space for the sacred.
But yeah, we can think again of Hugo and other 19th century writers. There's a book called Le Temps des Prophètes, the time of the prophets, and these prophets are actually romantic authors, romantic poets who saw themselves as the new voices of the sacred in the absence of the traditional Catholic voices that were no longer that acceptable or credible. So.
Does anyone else have any more questions? If you do, go ahead and type it up and send it through the Q&A. Do you think we should try to to share the screen again and see some of your images?
Good. Good. Okay, let's see.
So I hit share screen, but I can't see your presentation come up.
So
There.
so we have, images of churches that are sold, demolished, or burned. So the Romantics have all these, images of ruins, and the persecuted priests. So persecuted is a mild word for being beheaded, and this is, a very common representation of Mary Magdalene with Christ on the cross, and this is, so. Fantine on her deathbed with Monsieur Madeleine, crying, or it almost replicates this kind of iconography. And I also talked about, this very pure spiritual union of Marius and Cosette. So it's a marriage, but it's not like, it's they just kiss and that's it. That's what Victor Hugo says. And so we have the marriage of the Virgin, and here we have the sacred or spiritual kiss. There are other images where you can actually see Saint Peter and Saint Paul kissing on the mouth. It was, so early Christian representations, show or depict Saint Peter and Saint Paul kissing on the mouth because it is considered a sacred spiritual kiss. So it's almost as if we could see these images translated into Victor Hugo's prose. When you have such a depiction of, as I said, Fantine on her deathbed, Eponine with her hand pierced by a bullet to save Marius, or even Marius and Cosette's marriage. So these were my images.
I like the word you used, translation, that in a way Victor Hugo is translating maybe his moral, ethical Christian vision through some kind of literary filter, and the kind of product that comes out of that is like an inverted, maybe a distorted form of Christianity. But I think, maybe I should ask this: do you think that the basic Christian myth, the basic kind of Christian meaning comes through without all of the religious trappings? Does it come through in Les Miserables?
I think it does. At the same time, I would be cautious of, thinking of Hugo's moral principles, because he was not a very moral person, and he wrote Les Miserables after he was caught by a guy with Victor Hugo was with this guy's wife, and adultery was severely punished back then. But because Victor Hugo had an important position, he had immunity, so he wasn't sent to jail, but the mistress was sent to jail. But anyway, so this is a spicy detail. So Victor Hugo himself does not live a necessarily moral life, but he is aware of the necessity of some principles, and most of them in Les Miserables and even in Notre Dame de Paris are derived from Christian morals. So we have this idea of love and sacrifice, and charity, and so Hugo sort of interprets that sometimes in his own way, in his own paradoxical way. But I would say that the principles that he's trying to illustrate in Les Miserables or other writings are derived from Christian principles. They may not be exactly Hugo's personal principles, but so that's something else. So this distance is something else.
Do you think Hugo intentionally tried to transport these myths, these Christian meanings into his work, or was it just kind of the air that he breathed and the water that he drank, so to speak, and it just maybe unconsciously he put them in there? What do you think?
Well, I think that there's something very methodical in everything he does, and even in the way, like for instance, he say like he writes or rewrites French history in verse. The way he writes certain biblical passages again as poetry. So I think that there is something very methodical, very deliberate in what he's doing. And I think that we should not forget that he, like almost everything he writes, has many purposes. So among other things, Notre Dame de Paris was meant to draw attention to Notre Dame. Le dernier jour d'un condamné à mort is meant to fight against death penalty. And I don't know, Bug Jargal, we talk about slavery. So everything is very well built to convey certain meanings, let's say.
But were you referring to his book, The Death of a Condemned Man? No, The Confession of a Condemned Man? Is that what it is?
It's the last day of a...
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lesser known. I read somewhere that book really influenced, I think, Camus and maybe even Dostoevsky.
Yes, yeah. And in a way, Hugo wanted that, like he wants an impact. And we can see that his texts do have an impact. And I think that it is very interesting that I talked about Les Miserables and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. We haven't mentioned the adaptations, and the fact that there have been so many adaptations makes us think that his texts, these novels, are still alive, and they're carrying a meaning that is open enough, kind of like a sacred meaning, that it can be illustrated or retranslated, retransposed in so many ways. So,
earlier we were talking about another Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, and how he was roughly a contemporary of, probably a little bit older, but he was roughly a contemporary of Hugo. He famously traveled to America and analyzed what democracy, how it was lived in America. And one of his famous observations is that Americans' religious and spiritual life was strong and active and vibrant, and it served a civic function. Even if, and he was a big proponent of not tearing down religion, even though he was a conflicted Catholic himself. He said that even if someone believes in pantheism, it serves the public good. Do you think that he had any connection at all to Victor Hugo? Those two, did they have any connection?
I don't know. I haven't thought about that. I actually don't know. But well, I think that so first of all, because he's Alexis de Tocqueville, we can see that he's probably more conservative, and his wonderful book of democracy in America is in a way written about America, but at the same time it's a constant comparison with France. I think that when talking about the presence of religion or religions in America, Tocqueville also deplores all this, let's face it, violent destruction or deliberate destruction of religion that France had seen. This, very determinate opposition to religion. So yes, so Tocqueville is, way more conservative, we can say.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming here and speaking with us. I mean, this is almost like just the beginning of a continuing, ongoing conversation about something very relevant to us today, which is the need for the sacred in our ever secularizing society, and the need to channel that in the right ways. So I know I will be thinking about this and reflecting upon this. So thank you very much. Do you have any parting words before we dismiss?
Well, I think that, so it would be interesting to try to read, whether you're reading Dumas or other French 19th century authors. It would be interesting to see this persistence of the sacred, and you'll see that it is there, this haunting of something that was there and maybe still exists. And yeah, so even when you read ghost stories and other Gothic novels, you may reflect upon this persistence of the sacred in an unusual way.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely will have an eye for it now. And it does remind me of something that Leo Tolstoy practiced. And he talked about how the function of literature should be to make things strange, make the normal.
Oh, yes.
Make it. I think Victor Shklovsky said the same kind of thing. And I think that is what Hugo's Gothic literature does. And Les Miserables, it makes common notions strange. It kind of twists them and turns them, and it makes us look at them in different dimensions. So
yes, because this is when we notice them, when they are uncommon. And we'll come back to this definition of the sacred. So the profane space is homogeneous or undifferentiated, while the sacred is different. So that's it is defined by the difference.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for tuning in, and hopefully we can see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.